I'm very pleased to be with all of you here this evening at the Clinton School for Public Service and to have the opportunity to speak with you. Each of you is here at the Clinton School because you believe in public service, in the value of contributing to the well-being of others, helping our society sustain all of our citizens, and to improving the lives of people around the world. This is a wonderful career direction to take, and I congratulate and admire those of you for your choice. The particular way that each of you who are students here are going to utilize your education after leaving, the particular way that you are going to contribute is of course going to vary, and many of you will, needless to say, have very varied careers yourselves. So as a group, you're going to have a wide variety of experiences as you take your education and contribute to the common good, whether it's locally, nationally, or internationally. And the diversity of these experiences will not only be diversity of purpose, but there'll also be diversity of roles as supporter, as team member, and as leaders. We all know that many of the challenges in the public sphere today are very considerable. Many of these problems are not easy. If they were, somebody in all likelihood would have solved them already. So we have a real question with difficult problems, which is how can we be most effective in addressing them? And we have to ask this question because the reality is that we're all familiar with ideas and ambitions that start off with the best of intent, but end up not working so well. Or maybe they work, but they have other consequences that turn out to be just as bad as what it is you were trying to solve in the first place. So what are the key issues? What is it we actually need to understand to increase our chances of being successful? And what I'd like to discuss today are some of the issues that, to me at least, and at least based on my own personal experiences, what are these issues that are central? What things do we need to grapple with in order to be successful? And these issues that I'm going to bring up, which of course are not the only issues, just the ones I'm going to discuss this evening, these issues center around the idea of complexity, which I will explain exactly what I mean by that in a moment. And I will touch on two related matters. First, how do universities contribute to the public sphere, particularly in light of complexity? And second, what are the key things that you, like all of those who want to make meaningful contributions, that you should keep in mind in order to be most effective in the context of a complex world? My own experience, beyond that of mathematics professor and baseball fan, has involved leading the University of Chicago as president, being provost at Brown for 4 years, and holding a number of other leadership positions at Chicago before going to Brown. The University of Chicago, like many research institutions, including the University of Arkansas that we're here today, is a pretty complicated place. We have an undergraduate college, 6 professional schools, 4 divisions for doctoral education. We have the largest academic press in the country. We run 2 national laboratories for the United States Department of Energy. We operate a major hospital, 2 museums, a professional theater, and more. But with all of this, we have become more deeply and increasingly involved in working on some of the key problems that are vexing urban America and that have done so for some time. And we're doing this not only in a scholarly way, which of course we've done for a long time, but also in a way that involves direct engagement. Many of these direct engagements involve partnerships. They involve partnerships with the city of Chicago and the communities and community organizations, particularly on the south side of Chicago. This work includes a major effort regarding K through 12 education, the various problems connected with healthcare delivery in an urban environment, family services, adult education, job programs, legal services, business formation, and much more. And in all of this work, I have found the appreciation of complexity absolutely essential to being effective and to making real progress. And so what is it that I mean by complexity? I've used this word several times now. I now owe it to you to tell you what I'm talking about. So you've all heard the phrase that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And often this is meant as a type of indication of some aberration or something special or peculiar. You have a situation and somebody says, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, as if this is news. Otherwise, why would they say it? But in fact, that statement is virtually always true. And why is that? And the answer is really very simple, but very important to pay attention to, which is that the parts actually have a relationship to each other. They're actually not independent. If you change one, it may have an effect on the other. So to understand the whole, you need to know not only what the parts are, but how the parts relate to each other. And in this way, we see that we should think of the whole as the sum of the parts plus the set of relationships between the parts. And that very simply is why the whole is greater. It's because of the last plus. Now, this simple observation that understanding something demands that you not only understand the components, but the relationship of the components is always important to keep in mind. A failure to understand these relationships often leads to disappointing results. But as simple as what I've just said is, it is remarkable just how often this feature is ignored, and people act and policies are made that try to reduce complex situations with many parts and relationships between these parts to something that's much simpler, and in fact is often too simple. So in a few moments, I'm going to illustrate this rather abstract discussion with several very concrete examples of different types that all have to do with policy or questions of implementation. So I'd like to focus on three types of complexity, which, at least for the purposes of today, I'm going to call conceptual complexity, organizational complexity, and individual complexity. And I'll bring forward concrete examples for each one of these. And after that, or perhaps even during that discussion, I'll describe what I've found to be useful approaches to enabling an individual to deal with these various types of complexity, and why universities, in light of these complexities, have a particular contribution to make. So what do I mean by conceptual complexity? So here I mean understanding the full scope of the matter you are trying to address, and I think what that means will become clear when I talk about a couple of examples. So let's take the example of K through 12 education in the United States. So I think we all recognize that there's a major problem here. Many of the large urban educational systems in cities throughout the country, including that in Chicago, have failed to adequately serve several generations of city youth. And so we have the question, what do we do? Now, for many years, people have approached this problem by looking for the key issue that would fix it. Okay, how do we fix this problem? And so you can ask, do we need better curriculum that would capture students' imaginations? Do we need better training for teachers? Do we need more local control of school systems? Do we need better technology? Do we need longer school days? Do we need to bus students from problematic schools to better schools? And as these questions got asked, programs would go into place because we would seize on one of these matters as the key issue, the one we thought, here, addressing this point, this is the way to make things better. But in fact, many of these approaches really had rather marginal impact. And why? Because the problem here was complex. There are many factors that go into this problem, and they all affect each other. One can't isolate out just one issue and think that by changing that, all would be made better. And we've seen that over and over again by experiment. So understanding that we need to address all of these ingredients and more ingredients at once, that we need to take into account the way they relate to each other, is essential for real success. And we're finally starting to see some real rays of hope in addressing this essential problem for our society. And it's essential so that we give all students an opportunity and that we're able to change the trajectory for many individual students, their families, and therefore for our society. So each of these rays of hope, and I think many of you are familiar with the Harlem Children's Promise Zone in New York City as an example. So each of these rays of hope, whether in New York City or Chicago or elsewhere, is dependent on the realization of the complexity of the problem, and then the need to attend to the complexity in finding solutions. So let me give you another important and salient example, namely concern about climate change. So a number of years ago, but not so many, really, the way people started to look at this problem was the following, which is the United States and Western Europe are the great consumers of energy, and therefore that reducing our energy use was the most important step we could take. And while we were doing this, nuclear energy development, for example, was discouraged by members of both political parties. Research on nuclear energy came to a standstill for a generation. Our training of nuclear engineers was severely curtailed as an effective and direct result of national policy. What was put in place, for example, emissions standards for automobiles and regulations on gasoline mileage were major targets of environmental policy. And these steps, of course, were very important, these steps around the internal combustion engine, but yet they're really a very small piece of the whole puzzle. I don't think there's anybody in the world right now who thinks that changing the gas mileage for cars in the United States and Western Europe is actually going to solve the world's problem on climate change. So how does this problem look now? Right now, the way we would think about it is that climate change is greatly linked to energy production and the byproducts of that production, that the demand for energy in the world is increasing rapidly and will continue to increase rapidly, and that this increase is actually for very good and important reasons. The populations of China and India combined are 8 or 9 times the population of the United States, 4 times the population of the United States and Western Europe combined. And the demand for energy use in these countries will dramatically increase as we continue what is now an ongoing process of having 2 billion people move beyond a subsistence economy into an economy that will improve the quality of life for a massive number of people. And I would say, hopefully, the same will eventually follow for energy demand in other very populous countries in Asia and Africa, because there are still a lot of people left, even if China and India look glorious, which they don't yet. And right now, we do not know where all this energy is going to come from. The technology available today will not produce this energy in a sustainable way. So to address the climate change problem now, we see it must be confronted on a global scale, that the anticipation of massive increases in the production of energy will need to be a part of the equation, that conservation in various forms continues to need to be part of the equation, that different countries are going to prioritize various energy policies in a different way because there are different states of economic evolution, that research into technology of multiple potential energy sources is essential, and much more. So if we imagine now that there would be one simple solution, so for example, utilize existing technology in solar panels more broadly, this is simply not going to solve the problem. That doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do, but it's just not going to, you're not going to get your hands around this total problem with this, let's do this one thing approach. Now, another feature of this is that we also need to realize that our current use of hydrocarbons produces problematic amounts of carbon dioxide. But we also need to take into account what will be the consequences of the production of massive amounts of energy by other means. Will there be other detrimental effects? How will we anticipate and weigh them? We've seen various examples of this and already anticipate various examples of this around questions of land use, around competition with agriculture, around what will it do to various coastal conditions, depending upon what type of energy you actually imagine using. And with nuclear energy, of course, you have certain issues as well. You have various sorts of waste. So we can't answer all of these questions now. We don't know what the answers to these questions are. But I hope you see that it's essential that we take on the understanding of this full system and not just look at one simple factor and imagine that this one simple factor is going to be the key. Climate change, energy production, the decrease of poverty around the world are actually all closely linked. And this is a linked set of problems that have components that are economic, technical, scientific, political, social, and cultural. And while we can't design a simple and unified solution, integrated thinking about this complex problem is essential. So these are two examples of what I would call conceptual complexity. If one's going to undertake to contribute to a problem, we should not yield to the temptation to view it in an overly simple way. And while the examples I've given are very big and very complex problems, the first, one of the fundamental problems for the United States, the second, one of the fundamental problems for the world over the coming decades. So these are big issues. This habit of mind of not overly simplifying, but actually trying to understand the problem more fully can be applied, and I think is important to apply even in very localized problems. Now, while I'm on this topic of conceptual complexity, let me discuss something about the special nature of what universities have to offer for dealing with problems such as these. And the school education problem and the energy climate problems are good examples to think about, and they're examples that we've spent a lot of time thinking about at the University of Chicago. And so when you think about these problems, you can ask yourself, where do you find the place where the components of these issues can be analyzed both separately and in terms of the relationships to each other? And where do you find a place in thinking about a climate energy issue, where do you find a place that has the scientific, economic, and social analytic capabilities necessary to think about this in a substantive way? And where do we find a place that can foster argument and debate that's necessary to clarify these relationships and the inevitably conflicting views about them? So I've articulated the issue of having multiple components and having relationships between these components, but yet it doesn't mean that it's all obvious what these are. People will argue about it. People will have different views about it. And clarifying that becomes a feature of this issue. And it only gets clarified through argument, debate, and people listening to each other and indeed arguing with each other. And one of the key features of universities, of course, is that they have the capacity to do all of these things. And not only do they have the capacity, but there are really very few other environments where the totality of those things actually can or do take place. And therefore, because of the very complexity of the problems that we confront, universities can play an essential role in our society's ability to confront our most vexing problems. For some of them, it's really essential that universities play some of this role. And with that comes, I believe, a responsibility to do so. So let me just mention very quickly, as an example, two projects that we've undertaken really around these two problems at the University of Chicago. So first, we've created an urban education institute that is specifically devoted to taking on, in understanding first, the complexity of improving urban school education, and then to actually implement this understanding through the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute, actually running 4 charter schools on the south side of Chicago, building a network of other schools in Chicago, public schools that communicate about best practices, including our charter schools, and a number of related issues. So in this approach that we're taking, We are looking at all of the kinds of features that I addressed before and more. It's very data-driven, very analytically driven, and we are seeing major improvement in the education of children on the South Side, and we're taking this experience and working towards defining a model that we hope can be applied much more generally across the nation. And in the energy sphere, we have, among other projects, begun working on a complex suite of computer models which take into account various issues around energy supply, government policies, and climate evolution that we hope can provide a tool for the analysis of what's inevitably the very complex impact of various potential energy policy decisions. So both of these problems that I've been discussing at some length now are too large to be resolved by one effort at one time. We don't imagine that our effort alone is going to resolve them, but we do believe that these are examples of how one can contribute to these fundamental complex issues. So let me turn now to a second type of complexity, namely organizational complexity. And organizations, whether they're formal or informal, or now we can speak of virtual organizations, are actually the vehicle for most things being accomplished in the world. So to be sure, there are examples of great and significant achievements by individuals acting in isolation, but organizations are designed to make everyone's ability to contribute greater because they're able, when you're working in an organization, to leverage each other's work and abilities. So even in places, and universities are certainly examples of these places, where you have a very defined and great individual effort, it takes place in and hopefully is enhanced by the ambient environment, structure, and supports of the university and the interaction with various colleagues, whether it's faculty, students, or staff. Most of you here at the Clinton School are, in fact, going to find yourself subsequently in an organization, large or small, that hopefully is designed well to accomplish its mission. So what do I now mean by organizational complexity? So organizations, whether they're large or small, usually have several specialized components, and each one of necessity should reflect some key aspect of the organization's work that's necessary to accomplish its mission. And the functioning of the organization is dependent upon these various components not only doing their job, but being integrated into a coherent whole. So just as problems and issues are complex, with need for an integrated approach, so organizations are complex. Sometimes, in fact, in direct response to the complexity of the issue that defines the organization's mission. And in direct analogy to the difficulty of a simple approach to a complex problem, there's a common difficulty that leads to organizations not living up to their potential and even being dysfunctional. Namely, these difficulties arrive when these separate specializations do not communicate adequately and are not adequately coordinated, and the sense that the separate parts can operate independently and not be thought of in a holistic way is to ignore the complexity of the organization, much akin to ignoring conceptual complexity. So let me give you an example at a very large scale, an organization that we're all very familiar with, namely the United States government. So let me pose a particular dilemma, and let's see how the federal government thinks about it. So here's a dilemma the country now confronts around immigration policy. So we have those in the government who are concerned about economic growth and therefore of necessity the development of science, technology, and innovation. So for example, the Departments of Energy, Commerce, and Treasury are all one way or another concerned about this issue. Now, if you look historically at the development of science in the United States, it has been fueled and vastly improved by wave after wave of immigrants to this country. The European and Asian immigrations of the early and late 20th century, the Jewish immigration around World War II, the Eastern European and Russian immigrations of the post-Cold War period, each of these, and other immigrations as well, each of these contributed powerfully to the development of science, technology, and innovation in the United States. And consequently, immigration in this way, but this is only one way, there are many other ways as well, has contributed to a strong national economy, which is the indispensable foundation for national security. I think anything else is ultimately an illusion. So, at least for the long run. So on the other hand, so that's one set of issues regarding immigration. On the other hand, there are those who are responsible, have a direct responsibility for protecting the United States against terrorist acts. For example, the Department of Homeland Security. And their belief, or at least their actions seem to imply that their belief, is that a more open immigration policy increases the probability of terrorism. Even if these probabilities are very small, they're working on very small numbers. And so they believe that significant curbs on immigration, or even on various types of visas, offer greater protection. So here you have two considerations about immigration policy. And even as regards the single question you can ask about national security, these two considerations point in totally opposite directions. And you have agencies that are responsible for the issues that lead these things pointing in totally opposite directions. So therefore, if you're thinking about the federal government as a whole, it would seem essential that there be communication and coordination around this issue. This would demand conversations between the Departments of Homeland Security, Energy, Treasury, Commerce, and State about a long-term immigration strategy that takes into account these legitimate competing considerations. Does this exist? I'm not sure, but it certainly should exist. So this is an example at a very large scale, but it's just an example of something that can and does happen with great frequency, even in the smallest organizations. So people need to be attuned to the complexity of the organization that they're working in, and not assume that just one part of an organization can always independently do things without impact on the important work of other parts of the organization. Now, the third and final type of complexity that I wanted to discuss is individual complexity. And by this I mean the set of motivations and incentives that an individual has in a given situation. So imagine, as you can easily do, an individual who goes to work for an organization. So what is it they want when they go to work? You have a job. What are you doing there? So hopefully you believe that the overall goals of the organization are of value and that it offers you an opportunity to contribute to advancing these goals. You also want, most of the time, to have some job security. You likely, at least over time, want to make more money. You want more responsibility, which entails being chosen for promotion. These are very standard types of motivations that most people have. Maybe everybody doesn't have them, but lots of people have them. The way an organization is structured is going to give people incentives to perform their job in a certain way in response to those kinds of goals. And it's a key problem for organizations if the incentives for individuals don't align well with the mission of the organization, even if the person is acting in good faith and trying to do their job well. So the nature of the organization can come up against the complexity of individual goals and incentives. And so let me give a concrete example here that, again, is very topical, namely the question of government regulation. Now, there are always arguments about how much regulation is appropriate, and there are certainly lots of arguments now, and I absolutely do not want to enter that argument here about how much is good or bad in specific circumstances. That's not at all what I want to talk about. What I do want to discuss, though, is one feature of individual complexity that arises with any set of regulations. So regulation is put in place. Why is it put in place? Hopefully, if things are working well, regulation is put in place because the political processes that determine public policy reflect a belief that these regulations will contribute to the betterment of society. Now you have to enforce this, and how do you do that? Those being regulated need to comply with the regulations, and so there's usually some sort of bureaucracy that gets set up whose job it is to offer guidelines, interpret regulations when required, check on compliance, and then enforce penalties for non-compliance. So the job of this bureaucracy is to be the gatekeeper and the protector. So very often people will be promoted and their own interests advanced, and they'll be given more responsibility when they are seen as a better gatekeeper than the person in the next office. Now, many times this works absolutely just fine because the culture and tone of the office takes into full account the larger purpose in which the office is embedded. So the regulations are there to regulate something, and the something is usually things you want to happen. You just want them to happen in a regulated way. So if the regulating office takes into full account and understands this environment, and their actions are reflected in that, and the people's incentives are reflected in that, then it works very well. On the other hand, there are sometimes real problems, and these occur when the compliance bureaucracy loses sight of the fact that compliance is actually not an end in itself, but is a component of a larger system that has a societal purpose. And then you end up with incentives for individual promotion then leading to overzealous insight and sometimes to overzealous oversight. And in fact, this overzealousness can in fact do societal harm. So dealing with this issue needs to be taken into account when you're establishing and managing government oversight programs, but this is just one of the myriad examples of how incentives within an organization or bureaucracy can lead to mismatches with overall goals. So what are some of the ways of approaching this world of conceptual, organizational, and individual complexity that help make us more effective? Conceptual complexity can, in fact, be very challenging. One really needs to develop a habit of mind that is looking always for larger contexts, of listening to the views of other people, even when you don't like them, understanding there are legitimate competing interests. That's actually a shockingly hard concept for a lot of people, that in any one situation, it may not be that there's just one legitimate interest and everybody else is wrong. There really can be legitimate interests that are in real competition, and that's an important thing to recognize and understand. You have to realize that all arguments of value do not necessarily point to the same conclusion. And some simple arguments that seem to say that X is good need to be thought about in complex terms. X may have consequences that are good, but they may have consequences that are not so good. It may not solve your problem because of not taking into account all the factors driving the problem. So thinking this way will not necessarily tell you what to do, and one needs to avoid being paralyzed by the feeling that there's too much to do and I have to think about everything. But nevertheless, developing this open, listening, integrating, and complex way of looking at the world can help a great deal in contributing to and navigating some of the most challenging problems that we face. And working effectively with organizational complexity means balancing two things. First, having specialized areas within an organization of any size really is essential to building expertise and having the capacity for organizations to fulfill their mission. But second, these specialized areas need to be connected by effective communication and alignment. So developing the habit of communicating, of listening, and seeking out what others are doing, and making sure that those who will be affected by your own work actually know what you are doing, are essential to functioning well in the context of organizational complexity. This does not sound so hard. It sounds, oh, well, I can do that, that's easy. However, the reality is that many organizations vastly undercommunicate internally. It's a problem for almost every organization, and every senior leader is almost obsessed with this issue of how do I make sure everybody knows what other people are doing. Many of you will eventually become leaders in which you oversee multiple specialized activities, and it will be your responsibility to see that they communicate and are aligned with the overall mission. And with respect to individual complexity, it's extraordinarily useful to pay attention and understand individuals' incentives. So one often hears questions about why person A is somehow not pulling together with us. Why don't they get with the program? And rather than think simply that, oh, they're not doing a good job or they're just an annoying person, it's valuable to try to understand the incentives for them within or without the organization. And as a leader, you need to pay attention to how you might be unwittingly giving people incentives to do something you are, in fact, not happy with. And in the public sphere, particularly with important stakeholders both within and outside an organization, understanding individual incentives can be crucial for getting the results that you want. So for those, like many of you here, who are entering public service, at one time the idea of go out and do was an operative maxim. I think this is a good maxim, but it's actually not good enough maxim. People go out and do all the time. Sometimes they do the sorts of things that are ineffective. Sometimes they're even counterproductive and ill-advised. You have an opportunity in your time to make a true difference. And what we need now is for people, for you, not only to go out and do, but to go out and be smart. We need people to be thoughtful. We need a world in which we see clarity that may be hard-earned because of the complexity we face, and not just action based on the comfort of simplicity. We need an environment where discourse and debate, seeing problems from multiple perspectives, and thinking about a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts are seen as an important path to meaningful contribution. These are challenges that we all face. They've been faced before, they'll be faced again, and you will face them. There's a great deal that needs to be done, and the commitment to the public good that you have made is a noble one, and it's a valuable one. And with hard work and commitment, and when it will help you, remembering the complexity of our world, I'm sure that you will make great contributions to our society in whatever path you take. And thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you so we can all hear you. Steve?
Dr. Zimmer, thank you for being here. I'm glad you're a fan of Hamlet, because my question is this: don't we have to strike a balance between oversimplifying and acting maybe in a misguided way on our oversimplification on the one hand, and being too carried away with all the nuances and complexities on the other hand, because otherwise don't we get paralyzed as Hamlet was and unable to make a decision and act?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I don't mean to say here is that everybody in the world needs to think as if they were a university professor, because university professors are, generally speaking, focused on thinking, and that's what their job is. And you're absolutely right that, as in many things in life, being effective requires finding this balance. And I agree 100% with what you're saying. Finding the right balance is the issue. And so my remarks here were not meant to say that one should spend all of one's time focusing on these issues, because as I indicated at one point, you have to avoid the paralysis of feeling like you've never collected enough information, never thought about enough issues. Acting in the world inevitably demands acting with uncertainty, acting with incomplete information. But what I am saying is that one needs to take an approach in which this becomes a component of what gets added into the mix. Don't just say, here's a problem, here's what seems to be a cause, let's go do it. You can save yourself a lot of time, a lot of heartache, and become more effective in action if you find the right balance. So thank you for that comment.
Right over here.
Do governmental organizations suffer more from this organizational complexity, the lack of communication within that private enterprise?
I guess I'm not entirely sure of the answer. I know that many, I'll just say it, at the University of Chicago, for example, which is a private institution, spend a lot of time making an effort to get pieces of the organization, make sure they know what they're doing, that other people know what they're doing. I think it's a very and I know lots of private situations where this is an issue. People are very busy. They've got things to do. They feel like they're trying to get their job done. And telling that one over in some other spot what they're doing or asking them what they're doing sometimes is not the first thing on their mind. But it can be that what they're doing, if they do it, it's going to have a huge impact on what somebody else is doing if they don't know it. And that's why there's this constant pressure that we keep applying to make sure people are, in fact, talking to each other. So I can't really give you an answer about, I probably don't have enough experience or haven't looked at this carefully enough to really compare government to private sector, but I think it's a major issue and major concern for every big organization.
Ali?
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Ali Turo. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. I think that you made a great point about our institutions of higher education being a place for all of the different minds to come together and address some of these complexities. And I was wondering, as a leader of one of the nation's finest institutions of higher education, if you could talk about the role that our colleges and universities can play in working with each other to bring some of the strengths from different universities from across the country together to tackle some of these issues.
Right. Well, one place where, certainly in a scholarly direction, which I would say is generally speaking a pre-action direction, this goes to our earlier question, there is an enormous amount of very natural collaboration. If you take a university professor, in a way, lives in two worlds. They live in their own university, but they also live in the professional academic community of their field, which goes across the country and often across the world. So I think there's an enormous amount of very natural communication and collaboration at that level that's simply based on the fact that faculty are constantly looking for who else is doing what they're doing, and how can that person's work help my work. So I think that takes place all the time. I think universities, to be honest, have been a little less successful at organizing in common ways around action projects. We've had various projects with Northwestern regarding poverty, for example, that I think have done well. But it's been a lot easier to do this based on faculty groups, at least in part because rightly, university leadership doesn't tell faculty what to do. I mean, faculty need to be driven by their own interests and their own agendas. So I think it's really been most effective and probably will continue to be most effective in that faculty-driven way.
We have time for one more question. Anybody? Okay.
Would you expand more on how this interesting concept of of you all doing the charter schools in Chicago?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's fascinating. And how does that work? How do you make that? I mean, that's just an interesting concept that you all are doing that.
Right. So this was, we have a very complicated history in terms of school education at the University of Chicago. So John Dewey was an early recruit of William Rainey Harper to the University of Chicago when William Rainey Harper became the first president of the university, and Dewey spent something like a decade or so at the university, founding what was then called the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, which is a K through 12 school, and ultimately leading to the School of Education. We then actually closed our school, or what had evolved to a Department of Education, because we weren't happy with either the way it was we didn't feel it was connecting enough to the schools themselves, nor was it connecting enough to the social science disciplines that should have an enormous amount of input through their methodology. So it just felt isolated, and the faculty at the time decided to close that school. Phoenix-like, however, what grew up out of the closure of that was, I would say, a two-pronged approach that first said we wanted to do something that was much more connected to what was actually going on in the schools, that wasn't distanced from it. And we wanted to do something that had much more connection in a deep way to the methodologies of social science disciplines. And we wanted those two things to be connected to each other. So we now have a multidisciplinary academic unit, which is called the Committee on Education. Committee in Chicago has a special meaning because it's actually an academic term. Maybe some of you have heard of the Committee on Social Thought, which is probably the most famous example of such. And this is a group of faculty from multiple disciplines who are interested in work on school education. So people from economics, people from human development, people from social service administration, people from sociology. So people embedded in disciplines who are working on issues connected to school education. So that's one unit. The other unit is this, and that's really the analytic and scholarly unit. Then we have this institute this Urban Education Institute, which is informed by the work of that faculty, has a separate director, and it is running a collection of activities which are basically the applied and direct mode connected to the schools. So we have 4 charter schools. Together they go from pre-K through 12. Students are admitted by lottery. We do not cherry pick students from the South Side. There has to be an agreement that the parents and the student have to agree that they're going to take it seriously, but the South Side of Chicago is so underserved. There's an enormous demand to get in, enormous demand, and we just take students by lottery. And most of them come in way behind what are standard tests and grade level, and within a couple of years, they're up to or well beyond that. So we have those schools, and then our goal is really not just to run 4 charter schools. So these 4 charter schools are connected to this Committee on Education, and in fact, we've discovered that we attract faculty now because this is a place where their ideas actually can see manifestation inside these schools. So it becomes something real, not just an abstract thing. And as I indicated briefly, part of the goal here is to take our experiences from these 4 charter schools and say, what of this is scalable? So the greatest fear one would have in my position is that, yes, we're doing a great job with these charter schools, but that's because we're taking a group of people who are smart, ambitious, hardworking, dedicated, and putting them to work on a task, and they're going to succeed, and they're going to do a better job. If that's all that's happening, that's not so good, because we can't reproduce the University of Chicago all over the country. So the real question is, what are we doing that's scalable? And so there's a whole effort and analysis of actually trying to understand what it is that's scalable through the charter schools, and that's where both people from the Committee on Education become involved, and where a whole other research arm, analytical research arm of the Urban Education Institute becomes involved. So it's a major and multifaceted effort. And one thing that, I'll just say one other thing about this before stopping, is that one of the things I've been extremely encouraged by is that we have an enormous interest from the Friends of the University, from private philanthropy in the Urban Education Institute. And not only that, which of course I'm happy about, it's part of my job, but even for people sometimes we see who I'm talking to about other things tell me that, well, they are supporting some other K through 12 educational effort. And where I would much prefer to see them supporting ours, I'm just very encouraged that there's a lot of people who are prepared to give back if they can find a vehicle that they can believe in is really going to make some progress. So the terrible thing about this is the feeling of abandonment of these kids, and we can't abandon them.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Bob Zimmer.